Hi, Houston.
You look good. You look good. Thank you for being so game. Oh my God.
I'm always game. I think this is the new symbol of the resistance, right? The frog.
We're the frog revolution. We need a brand. Yeah. Pass that around. What do you learn hanging out with your chickens?
People always ask about the chickens, right? I mean, there's sort of a serious message. We became pandemic chicken owners because we're such lovely, doting parents. And you know, it actually is really great because I don't know about y'all, but I wake up in the morning, my phone has exploded by the time I've woken up. There are 300 new stories I need to read. 5 terrible things have happened. And so I take a minute and I make myself a cup of coffee and I sit down outside, I feed the chickens worms. Some of them jump up on my lap. They're very, very greedy. But it is a nice moment for me. And my takeaway is this, you know, chickens may or may not be your thing, right? They're not for everybody. But whatever it is in your life that just gives you that moment where you can take a breath and relax before the deluge, make sure that you give yourself permission to do that right now, because we are living through a tough time. I teach a seminar at the University of Alabama on democracy. And my democracy students had the opportunity to hear Professor Timothy Snyder, who many of you may know from his book on tyranny. He was speaking to actually a group that one of my friends had put on, and she let my students listen in. And at the end, somebody asked him, Professor Snyder, what should we be doing? What's the most important thing that each of us can do right now? And he stopped for a minute, and he said something that really surprised me. He said, hug your friends. Make sure that you hug your friends close and tell them that you care about them. And to me, that's such an important thing. So when I'm with my chickens, I have that feeling. But when I'm with all of you, I have it too. And I think this is a moment for us to just be human beings first.
Yeah. So it was just so exciting to see your book, number 4, New York Times bestseller list. This is your first book. How are you feeling?
I've never been so surprised in my life. I mean, it was really great, right? Because I wrote the book and I wrote it pretty fast because I understood that nobody wanted to wait 2 years for a book about saving democracy to come out. And my publisher is really lovely. Most new authors won't say that about their publisher, but I was blessed with an unbelievably wonderful publishing partner. And so I wrote fast, I wrote in isolation, and I didn't know if it was good. I was worried because I wrote fast and I didn't have time to send chapters to my friends and say, look at this and tell me where my argument is stupid or flawed or how I can make it better. And I didn't have the luxury of doing that, which is really difficult for me because I'm a lawyer and I'm an appellate lawyer. I'm used to writing briefs for appellate courts and having people proofread them and endlessly argue, about what's good and what's bad and fix it and let it marinate and then go back to it. And I didn't get to do that with the book, so I apologize in advance for anything that's faulty in it. It's completely my fault because I did it, but I'm delighted by the reception to it. And my hope is that it will help people, it will convince people that we can't give up. For one thing, there's just not a good option, right? Giving up is not an option that we can take in this moment. But we really can, each of us, acting on our own, influence the outcome of the American experiment. We saw that a week ago Tuesday, when in elections across the country, that was y'all. And a lot of you who I spoke to before this event mentioned the success that you all had with your school board elections. And, right? This is an amazing thing. It is not a small thing. I included it in my newsletter when I sent it out tonight because I think people need to know that it's not just the election for the president that matters. It's our county elections, our school board elections, our public service commission elections. We need to restore democracy at every level of government in this country, and y'all did that a week ago.
And speaking about people you're running into, you've been on the road for 3 weeks now. What are you learning? What are you picking up? What are people saying to you?
I hear a lot of people, and especially before the election, by the way, because my book came out on the 22nd, so in advance, people who really wanted to believe that there was something that we could do, but who were afraid to believe that, because the election was a massive disappointment for so many people who were still sort of in shock from the idea that our fellow citizens would return Donald Trump to the White House despite having his first term in office and Project 2025, which tells us exactly what he intended. And so I think people were afraid to hope. Frankly, it's a little bit easier to talk to people after the election because that's a concrete example of what we can do. But the stories that I have heard in places like New York and Connecticut, Ohio, San Francisco, Los Angeles, Birmingham, Atlanta, are people who are committed to doing whatever they can do. It might be something modest like joining the League of Women Voters and getting involved. It might be writing postcards to voters in another state. Or it might be a big project. I've talked to people who've decided that they need to run for office themselves. I think that we just each do what's in front of us, the work that seems destined for us to do, and we count on the fact that all of us doing it together can in fact move mountains.
I want to stick with the law for a minute. Before I ask this question, how many lawyers do we have out here, or law students? Can you raise your hand? Lots of lawyers.
There are a lot of us. We're taking over, if you haven't noticed.
Well, we want you to do that because you guys are important. So first I want to ask you, what attracted you to the law yourself? Your father was a judge. Lots of people don't take after their parents. What was the draw for you to make a life out of the law?
Yeah, so it was my father-in-law. My husband's dad was a federal judge, and he sat on the Fifth Circuit, which includes y'all, before the Fifth and the 11th Circuit got split, and then he went with the 11th because he was in Alabama. And he was certainly a powerful motivation for both my husband and me to get involved in civil rights law. But it was my granddad who actually lured me towards law school, because my granddad, first-generation child of Russian immigrants who fled the Pale, fled from pogroms, believed so deeply in this country and how lucky we were. And it's sort of interesting to me in hindsight. My granddad, this little Jewish guy in Los Angeles, we lived in a city called Monterey Park that his great uncle had founded the hardware store. He had gone there during the Depression because it was a secure job at a time when jobs were hard to come by. But my granddad watched waves of immigrants. He watched waves of first Chinese and Japanese and then Vietnamese immigrants, big Mexican population, and he celebrated all of that to its fullest. He loved the culture, the food, the diversity that it brought, and he talked a lot to us as kids about the melting pot of America, and that stuck with me, both in the form of public service and a belief that the law was a great career.
Many people talk about the rule of law, but as you say in your book, people rarely define it. How do we go deeper? What should we appreciate about the rule of law?
So I teach a class on this. I teach a class on democratic institutions. This is a law school class at the University of Alabama. I don't know who's in the audience, but roll tide. It is obligatory that I say that, part of my contract. So, it's a fascinating conversation because I sit down with third-year law students and I say, tell me what the rule of law means to you. And I get a lot of, like this, right? But people will start talking about what they think it is. And we'll talk about, well, what are the democratic institutions that we have in this country? And it's easy to get the obvious ones, right? The presidency, Congress, the judiciary. A lot of people talk about the press. It's usually week 3 or 4 before we get down to understanding that it's really the people, the biggest democratic institution in this country. And so my filter for understanding the rule of law is thinking, how does that fit with American democracy? And what I conclude, and something that I would suggest for y'all to consider, it may work for you or not, is the notion that the rule of law is sort of the architecture that we build the political structure in this country of. One of the easiest ways to think about the rule of law is that we are a country of laws, not men. That means we're not subjected to the whims of a king when we decide our rights. And so we are a country where, at least until the Supreme Court said otherwise a couple of years ago, we thought that no man was above the law. Now we know that there's that one guy, right? But the principle is still an important one. And the Supreme Court, as it has done in other cases where it has made tragic mistakes, which I talk about in the book, it does come back and get them right eventually, and that's one that it's going to have to fix. But the important issue here is that we have rock bottom stability in this country because there is a rule of law that helps us understand the rules of the road. And so people are able to invest with certainty in businesses, in our economy, because they know how disputes will be resolved. If they have a dispute, there is a set of laws that tell them what their rights are. You can pay your landlord rent, or you can buy a house and pay the mortgage, because we have a rule of law system of government that defines our rights. And so for many Americans who never think about the rule of law, may never have heard that phrase, their lives are nonetheless secured by it. It's really our anchor. So I make a little pitch in the book for people to think about that. We've had the luxury in our generation of taking American democracy and the rule of law and our stability for granted, because it really hasn't been in question until the last couple of years that we would continue to be the great American democracy through our 250th anniversary next year and beyond. Now we have to be a little bit more intentional about it, and as any number of presidents have said, right, you have to fight for democracy in every generation. This is going to be our fight. It's not going to be on battlefields in Normandy. It's probably going to be in voting booths in 2026 and 2028, but it is nonetheless our fight for the rule of law.
Your book brings up Shakespeare's quote in Henry VI, where a rebel trying to overthrow the government says, "First, let's kill all the lawyers." And you point out in your book, Trump first went after the law firms. So your book has a special message about responsibilities for lawyers right now. Could you share that, please?
So let me be clear about this. I don't think that democracy belongs to lawyers. I don't think lawyers have any greater responsibility for protecting it than all of us do, and I also don't think that they have any specialized sort of insight that every American can't have, because something that I've really learned, this is my takeaway from sitting on TV, probably in boxes in your living rooms for those of you who watch MSNBC. The takeaway from that work has been incredibly uplifting. And it's that Americans are really, really smart. And that if people like me who've had this incredible opportunity of working at the Justice Department, if we take a few moments of our time to explain the details of how government works, of how the Constitution interacts with our rights as Americans, these issues that are increasingly of interest, if we're willing to invest back in the communities that gave us the opportunity to serve, every last one of you can understand the detail. And we see that every day. When I was a prosecutor for 25 years, I promise you nobody ever walked up to me in the grocery store and said, "Explain to me how the grand jury system works." But in the last few years, I have had that experience repeatedly where a total stranger has walked up to me, grabbed me by the shirt collar and said, I need to understand the difference between an indictment and an information. Those are such wonderful moments, and for me it's such an incredible honor to get to share that knowledge. And I noticed, by the way, other people doing that, my colleagues in public health, who have so graciously shared their knowledge and understanding about vaccines and epidemics with us so we can all understand. I think that's what actually makes us strong and great, is the fact that if we each take our specialized area of knowledge and share it with others, our communities are smarter, better educated, more dictator-proof. And so I view that as being the path forward. And for me, really, the joy of doing this is coming to realize that although lawyers are important and we have a big role to play in our communities, what's really essential is all of y'all.
Well, speaking about explaining, you relate so well to lay people. And so what's your advice to your students to communicate clearly?
That's such a good question, right? Because the big problem that we have right now in this country is sort of an epic failure of communication. I do talk with my students about this because, especially when I'm teaching the democracy class, I tell them, we're going to do this at two levels. One level is the theoretical study of the law. The other level is, what are you going to do for your community? Because when you're a lawyer, people will come to you with questions about how things work, or if, like in Alabama, we have elected judges every year for 72 hours before the election. We have a steady stream of people coming to our front door asking for thoughts about candidates for judgeships as people try to educate themselves. So lawyers do have this really special obligation. But I think the reality about these hard conversations we have to have in this country, because we have got to find a way to come back together. And that feels really difficult right now. I mean, I don't know about y'all. I have friends who are in MAGA. It's incredibly difficult to talk with them because they have been sucked into a cult and they just can't see the way back. And the real problem that we have is that we no longer have a common set of shared facts. We now live in Kellyanne Conway's universe of alternative facts. Don't like the facts don't back up what you want voters to believe, just make up your own facts and cram them down their throat. And if you're persuasive enough, if you're a good enough snake oil salesman, you can convince a lot of people. It's the old P.T. Barnum sort of thing, right? And so I think the conversations that we need to have, what I encourage my students to do as young lawyers, is to be thoughtful before you engage and to try to ground the conversations you have in true, known facts, to be fearless about defending the facts and talking with people about factual information as the basis for the decisions we make. And I'm going to give you a concrete example. I'm sure that y'all have heard a lot about voter fraud. So I'm just going to tell y'all that data, statistics, make it very clear that Donald Trump lost the 2020 election fair and square. There was not voter fraud. And look, that's by and large true in virtually all of our elections. I have a good friend who's a law professor in California, Justin Levitt, who spent a lot of time compiling data from a lot of different elections and concluded that there were 2 or 3 elections where the outcomes were tainted by fraud, and they were always small runoffs in like a city council election where 36 people voted. And in those cases, they came to light because that kind of fraud really makes itself apparent and it gets prosecuted. And the problem with elections in our country is not voter fraud, it's voter suppression. It's the use of voter fraud. It's the use of voter fraud as an excuse to suppress the vote. And we're going to see that in this cycle. Donald Trump is already doing it, saying that illegal aliens are voting. And here's what I would suggest you might want to say to people who have fallen for that. You know, imagine that you're a mom or a dad in Guatemala and you're worried about gang violence and the impact on your family. And so you decide to make the difficult journey to the United States where you subject your family to really difficult circumstances and you, by the grace of God, make it across the border into Texas. And you are able to avoid detection by ICE, and you're able to find work, probably work that's beneath your status in your home country, but you care about your kids, and so you're working hard every day to make it happen. You do not wake up one morning and say, I think I'm going to go vote illegally in the election, right? I mean, it's just, pardon my French, it's just a bunch of bullshit. We need to be prepared to say that and to say it fearlessly. And to ask them, tell me, why do you think that there are hundreds of thousands of people in this situation who've gone through this experience voting illegally? And by the way, they know that if they do that, it won't have any impact on the outcome of the election, right? 5 people voting. So look, sometimes it does happen that someone who believes that they're eligible to vote, but they're wrong about it, they might register. And that's why in every state there are election workers who are trained to catch those improper registrations before people ever vote. That actually happens and it works. In Georgia, they did an intensive project to look for 20 years to see had people wrongly registered and voted. And they found that not very many cases, and when it happened, state election workers more than up to the task of catching it before those people went onto the voter rolls. Those are the sorts of lies that we need to start calling out so that we can restore our conversations in our communities.
We had the most audience questions about the upcoming midterms, 2026. Many ask, will they be held? My personal excitement last week with Democrats overperforming, way overperforming, means that we're so capable of overperforming in the midterms when it's likely to be harder to vote. So I'm curious, what worries you about the midterms and what gives you hope?
Yeah, this is a great question. Let me tell you what doesn't worry me too much. I think that there will be elections in 2026, and here's why. Wannabe dictators love to cloak themselves in the legitimacy that an election brings to them. You know, Vladimir Putin still holds elections in Russia. The issue isn't whether you hold elections, it's whether they're free and fair. And in states like yours and states like mine, and really across the country, the challenge will be holding free and fair elections because Donald Trump has made it clear that he intends to attack the right to vote. A lot of you have probably heard about the SAVE Act, which is the embodiment of much of what was written in Project 2025 about voting. And it's a measure that would require, I think this is one of the most really troubling parts of it, it would require you to prove that you're an American citizen before you can register to vote. And not just the first time you register, by the way. If you move, if you need to update your registration, you would have to prove that you're an American citizen again. So how many of you have handy documents that are ready to prove your citizenship? A lot of y'all have them, and I bet it's largely a passport. Is that correct? There are a couple of other things that'll work, some kinds of military ID. There's a conversation about real ID and whether or not that might work. But mostly we're talking about passports, which cost a lot of money to get. And I'm from Alabama. I know a poll tax when I see one. If you have to pay $200, 200 plus, because you have to get a birth certificate and other documents, to get the passport, you have to have a photo taken, and then you've got to pay the, whatever it is, the $160 fee for the passport itself. That is a poll tax. And, you know, it's just so hard to understand how difficult this is going to be. If you are a woman and your name has been changed through marriage and your documents don't match up, you may not be able to vote without jumping through a lot of difficult hoops. A lot of students go off to college without documentation of citizenship, and it may become difficult for students to vote, which, by the way, is intentional because they do not want students voting where they go to school. So a lot of very complicated issues, but not the least of them, and maybe y'all feel this less in Texas. I certainly don't feel this in Alabama because I actually have to vote in person on election day because we have almost no, we have no early voting, very little absentee voting. But under this SAVE Act rule, to register to vote, you would have to take your identification down to the registrar in your county and register in person. There would be no more online registration, which is really a big deal even in Alabama, where under the Motor Voter Act, you can register at the same time you get a driver's license or update your boat license. And that would be gone. There would be no more souls to the polls, a great tradition in the Black community where people register to vote after church and then go and vote together doing early voting. So look, I think what we have to be prepared for is the fact that we're going to face unprecedented challenges. What gives me hope, though, is what Donald Trump can't do. The Constitution does not define a role for the president in running elections. Running elections belongs to the states, where we hold 50 individual elections conducted by our friends and our local family members and friends at local polling places. And Congress can have some say-so in time and place of elections. It can set some conditions, but Donald Trump can't do it. He can't do it without Congress's help. He can't do it without our acknowledgement in states. So some states will break bad. Some states will undoubtedly adopt these enhanced identification requirements. But you know, the SAVE Act itself did not pass in Congress because so many Americans were aware of what was in it and they were angry and they called their representatives and they demanded that they not pass it, a Republican Congress. And if we can do that in Congress, we can do it in states like Texas and Alabama. We just have to understand that this is the critical issue. And as they gear up to suppress the vote this year, when maybe we're not thinking that much about the election, we need to always keep the election and our ability to vote uppermost in our minds. If there's one thing I'd encourage you to get involved in, it's your local League of Women Voters or any other pro-voting group that lets you be a part of that advocacy.
And what's your advice for those entities that are responsible for managing elections, such as here in Harris County?
So I have a friend named Shenna Bellows who's running for governor in Maine. But right now she's the Maine Secretary of State. And you know, Maine is like a big rangy state with people who are really different. It reminds me a little bit of Alabama because they've got a really conservative part of the state and then they've got these big blue population centers. And I suspect that that's true across the country. We talk about red states and blue states, but that's not really true anymore. But the whole point of this is, Shenna, when she runs elections in Maine, is really hands-on, and she carries on this great tradition in Maine, something that Angus King started when he was the governor, of not really caring who you're going to vote for. That is your political decision to make, but caring deeply about your right to vote, which is a right that every American possesses. And we should make it as easy as possible for every eligible American to vote, even if that means you're the Secretary of State and you go pick up cookies and take them to polling places on election day to support poll workers, which my friend Shenna does do. I think that's what we need to demand, quite frankly, from all of our elected officials. We need to insist that although we understand the reality of retail politics, it's up to them to fight for our vote, to earn our vote if they want it. And at the same time, they have to make it possible for all of us to vote, easy to vote. You know, a former Secretary of State in Alabama talked about voting as a privilege and said it wasn't his job to make it easy for people. They had to go get identifications or do whatever it took and show that they deserved the privilege of voting. And that is just not how this country works. And he is no longer Alabama's Secretary of State, because that is wrong-headed. The new guy's not so swift either. But I think the point is, we sometimes give in too easily. You know, I've got 2 red senators, and it's easy to say they're not going to listen to me anyhow, which is why I keep up a thriving and very one-sided correspondence with both of them. I think, though, with our state officials, and certainly our county ones, we can put demands on them. And demand number 1 is, I'm an American, I'm entitled to vote. It's your job to make it possible for me to exercise my rights.
Earlier you were talking about facts and communicating facts back and forth. I was really struck when you asked your readers to discuss the novel 1984, how tyrants disorient people with language. So what did you learn from your readers about 1984?
So I write a newsletter on Substack called Civil Discourse. Substack is this sort of funky platform run by smart young people who understand technology. And people write all different kinds of newsletters on it. I get some of my dinner recipes there. I read about fashion there. I read about history, law, politics, and I even try to read about science, although it's a stretch for my feeble brain. But it's fun. And so I write on this platform that attracts people from all walks of life who may just stumble across your newsletter because they're there to get the hot updates on Alabama football, and somehow the algorithm, says, oh, come and read this law and politics newsletter written by an Alabama law professor. And so Substack is an interesting place, and the conversations that you have with people, because there are forums that go along with the newsletters, can be really fun. So I decided that we should read 1984, my newsletter subscribers, and I thought, like 20 people will read the book, right? And we'll have conversations. I had read it during the first year of Donald Trump's first term in office with my law students, and it felt very new and fresh that year. I hadn't read it since I was in college. And it resonated really strongly, right? This notion of a powerful government that would control what you could think and what you could talk about by restricting the language, the words that were available to you. If no words exist for a concept, then you can't talk with your friends and neighbors about it, let alone think about it. And so it was fresh and frightening, and it still felt a little bit, like being sort of a drama queen to read it that first year of the first Trump administration. And so fast forward to reading it, this year with my friends on Substack, where it did not feel fresh, new, or dramatic. It felt like the world that we were very much at risk of sliding into. And something that I learned in conversations, so we did a lot of conversations about the book. I had some of my friends, Ruth Ben-Ghiat, who some of you may know. She's an NYU professor, who wrote a book called Strongmen. She studies dictators and Mussolini in particular. And so Ruth and I talked about it. I did that with other friends. And what I learned from people was they not only viewed 1984 as a cautionary tale, an important wake-up call that we should all heed. I learned that there was huge value in reading fiction and sort of extrapolating fiction to understand where we find ourselves in America in 2020, 25, and what we need to do about it. Because just like there are lessons in history that we can learn, there are lessons in fiction, including my kids. I've inherited from them this love for dystopian young adult fiction, which all of my kids immerse themselves in. And I mean, you really do get ideas, and maybe it goes back to the first question we discussed about finding something that lets you take a deep breath. Sometimes fiction, even when it's dark, can just let you relax enough to put your arms around a topic and figure out what you need to do next. So I had a tremendous experience reading it. If you have not read it recently, strongly encourage.
Your book, you go into the Constitution quite a bit.
It's sort of a book about that.
It is. The Federalist Papers, what the founders were thinking, what they knew about human nature. The Constitution has worked pretty well for a long time. But what do you think the founders would say now? What are we learning now that needs fixing? How do we begin thinking about changing the Constitution or governing practices when we get to the other side of Trump?
Yeah. So if we're being honest with ourselves, we understand that we have never had a perfect democracy, right? This is a country that was born with the tragedy of slavery on its conscience. Women did not have full citizenship. We have rejected wave after wave of immigrants, and they've been forced to prove themselves over and over again. We have a democracy that's aspirational, and to me, that's the important thing about it. And that's what the founding fathers intended, because they understood, coming out of the rule of kings, which they were rejecting, that there were balances that had to be struck and that it might not be perfect. And so if you go back and read the Federalist Papers, which I did for you, so you don't have to do it, you can just read the book. But it's sort of fun. If you're nerdy like I am, you may really enjoy going back and reading that. And what you learn is that the founding fathers were very practical and very aware of their own limits. And what they did was they created a document that would allow us to continue to transform ourselves if we would take up that invitation. And so we have done that throughout our history. We have undoubtedly made advances. We still have to reckon with racism in this country, something that we have never done. But we have made progress in that area as we have in others. And the problem that we quite frankly face from Donald Trump and MAGA is that they're afraid of change. You know, Trump said during the campaign that he wanted to go back. And I don't know, is that back to 1950, which was not really a great era for a lot of people? For me, I'd like to keep going forward. And I look to my kids where even just in that couple of generations, you know, we've made so much of an advance for the LGBTQ community that acceptance that would have been impossible when I was growing up is now in many places, even in conservative places, automatic. My personal hope is that we hold on to that change and then keep advancing the promise of America to include more and more people, because my read of the Federalist Papers and the Constitution is that that's precisely what the founding fathers intended. That's why we have judicial review. That's why we have a Congress that can write new laws when our culture changes to require them. And so that, I think, is a broad societal picture of advancement, which I think is one of the foundational differences between the big tent, you know, that big, awkward, bulky, uncomfortable tent of the Democrats and the views of MAGA. But there are specifics. There is work that we will have to do at the end of this administration, and it will be difficult to do unless we have a true bipartisan consensus. That's why, frankly, it's so important to get started in the 2026 elections and begin to rebuild some of the guardrails in Congress by restoring majorities. I don't care if they're Democrats or Republicans, as long as they're pro-democracy. Those are the candidates that we need to figure out who they are and vote for them, because that will be essential work. You know, after Watergate, there was a moment where the country understood that the presidency had to be restrained. And so measures were put in place, but most of those measures are soft norms. They're not written into the law. One of those soft norms is that the President of the United States can't pick up the phone and call a U.S. attorney and tell that U.S. attorney to indict somebody who's one of his enemies. True story, when I was in DOJ, when I was the U.S. attorney, a certain Alabama senator, who I won't name, but he did go on to be attorney general, picked up the phone one day, and asked to speak with the duty attorney in my U.S. Attorney's Office, which is like a young, new federal prosecutor who's doing intake on cases. And this senator then proceeds to tell that young, new attorney that they need to prioritize a certain case involving one of his friends who's been bilked out of money for prosecution. And that prosecutor had the great good sense to go to her criminal chief, and they came directly to me. And I called the lovely folks in Washington, D.C. at Main Justice, and I said, hey, one of y'all needs to have a conversation with my senator and tell him don't ever do that again. Which they did. He was actually apologetic. But you know, the reality is senators don't do that, members of Congress don't do that. I mean, U.S. attorneys are usually pretty friendly with their members of Congress. I'm old friends with my representative, and we would like talk about family and kids and school, and that was it. We didn't talk about politics or cases for 8 long years. Those need to be laws, not norms. And the chief law that needs to be restored is the Hatch Act, which prohibits So y'all know what the Hatch Act is, so I don't have to tell y'all, but it needs to be strengthened and there need to be criminal penalties for violating it. My friend Jill Winebanks, who some of you may know, I do a podcast with Jill. She's such a great person. She was the only woman on the Watergate prosecution team. And she argued vigorously at the time that they should indict Richard Nixon. And she was overruled, and a decision was made that for the good of the country and to move forward, that wouldn't happen. But you know, Jill was right. And if they had prosecuted Nixon, there would be no question but that a president could be violated for acts committed in office after he left. All of the issues that stood in the way of holding Donald Trump accountable would have been resolved in that simpler moment. And so we now have to go through that painful process of restoring the presidency to the contour and to the amount of power that the founding fathers intended for it to have. It's a power-bloated presidency right now, you know, this unitary executive theory, this Donald Trump power grab that we're watching every day, that the Supreme Court, for whatever, won't rein in. That will take the American people demanding that Congress fix it for that to be right-sized.
I especially enjoyed reading about your conversation with your 22-year-old son about what it would take for him to feel engaged with democracy. Could you please share what you learned?
So my 22-year-old, the baby of my 4 kids, and the only one who has no interest whatsoever in politics. It drives me nuts. But he has like really nice, smart friends. And I happen to know that they all voted for Kamala Harris, because like I'm the mom that they tell that kind of stuff to. But what I really wanted him to do, well, I wanted him to read my book. And I wanted him to read it while I was writing it, because he had just graduated and he was at home and he was accessible. And so I finally said to him, you know, Ollie, what would it take for you to read a book about democracy, about keeping the Republican? And he's just like, no, it is not happening, Mom. And he was like, I'm just not interested. I'm not you. I don't want to read about politics. And I was like, but don't you care about democracy? And it turns out he has a very different relationship with democracy than I do. You know, I grew up in President Johnson's Great Society. I have some vague memories of Kennedy. I felt democracy in my bones as the reason that we had a good life, because my granddad spent a lot of time talking with us about that. And I lived through the civil rights movement with a mom who was an activist. And that's just baked into my being. My husband, his dad, before he went on the bench, was the chairman of the Alabama Democratic Party, back when the whole state, top to bottom, was Democrats. And he sort of led the faction of the party that fought off George Wallace, which is sort of a long story. But that form of democracy was baked into my husband's DNA too. And this is what my son Ollie said to me when I said, you know, well, do you at least want to go protest with me? And he says, Mom, I was 4 when the Occupy protests happened. And nothing has changed. Rich, powerful people still control Congress and the caucuses. So don't put that burden on me of going out and fixing it. You know, I'm like a 22-year-old kid. I don't have any power compared to millionaires who are running things. I mean, we had this like really depressing conversation where I realized that he saw democracy as something that had been broken for much of his life. His first memory of a president, he has a little bit of a memory of Barack Obama, but he mostly remembers Donald Trump as what an American president looks like. And that fills me with just so much sorrow. We have got to understand that their viewpoint is very different from ours, and it's incumbent upon us to go and talk with kids his age and younger, and even, you know, my older kids that are in their 30s. We have to make the case for democracy with them because they don't assume automatically that democracy is essential to having good lives. I think that they frankly don't understand how much of what they take for granted democracy provides for them. But we also need to talk with them about how democracy can make things better. So the issue that I use in my book is sort of the obvious one. It's climate change. You know, we have not made the progress that we should make. I mean, these 4 years of the Trump administration would have been essential. And we are going to have a lot of work to do, and we're going to need to do it quickly. But the point that you have to make with them is, if you care about climate change, well, you can see what Donald Trump is doing. In a democracy, it's possible for us to demand that things get done. I don't think that climate was at the top of Joe Biden's list, right? I think he had other priorities. But on day one of his administration, he put us back into the Paris Accords because there was powerful voter insistence that he do that. That's how democracy works. We make our desires known, and our elected officials, if they want to be our elected officials, put them into action. And so what I've tried to say to my kid is, if you care about climate, if you care about other issues, you have a much greater opportunity and ability to influence outcomes in a democracy than you do with the wannabe dictator who's only going to do what's good for him. So please make the case for democracy with the young people around you. I think it's essential.
I liked your emphasis, lawyers created Law Day.
Law Day.
And I remember Law Day very vividly in high school. It took place out of the gym, and they chose a jury and so forth. I just wanted to offer you an idea.
Okay.
I hope I'm not out of place. Kids, start at Kids Democracy Day. Call it KIDD, Kids and Democracy Day. Bring kids to speak at city council meetings for a minute or at a state legislature. I had a good experience with this. We were pushing a tree ordinance in Bel Air, a nearby city. And I asked my 9-year-old son if he wanted to speak. They have to give everybody 3 minutes, no matter what age they are. So he came up to the podium and he froze. And then he got his bearings and he started shouting at the city council people. He was beginning to learn who works for who. And he said, pretend you're a bird. How would you like it if somebody took a chainsaw and cut down your house? So I think if, we had thousands of kids speaking at city council meetings, just create a day, Kid Day and democracy, they would get some confidence and learn where their power is.
I think this is a brilliant idea. So I've had both the privilege of judging Law Day essays written by elementary school kids, and they're always great, right? And our daughter actually won it one year. It was a blind contest, and she won and got to go to the Alabama Supreme Court and read her little paper for law. Like, it's a super big deal for kids. But like your child, right? I mean, that's the wisdom that government needs right now. And so I'm going to flip your suggestion back on you and say, we should each, when we get really good ideas, we need to bring them into being. That's a great idea. Why not start Kids in Democracy Day in Houston, and I will partner with you in Birmingham and do one there, and we'll get it going. Do you want to do it?
Yeah, absolutely.
Let's do it. It's a great idea.
Be exciting.
I love it.
Thank you.
That's perfect.
You've got such a great emphasis in your book about civics and media literacy. And you bring up this great example of Finland schools. I saw a report on Finland media literacy on CBS Sunday morning. Finland wanted to teach their students about how to spot fake news because Russia's across the border and they're spewing out all this propaganda.
Sort of like what they're doing here.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Could you talk a little bit about civics, restoring civics, maybe with a combination of media literacy?
I really like the way you connect that. Civics education is something we don't do well in this country that we need to put more thought into and reform, and I have a lot to say about that. I like connecting media literacy with civics education because I think that they just have to go hand in hand. And the Finns are really great. There's actually this international media literacy assessment that's done every year. And it's always the Scandinavian countries and the European countries that come out on top because they've been having to do this for a long time because there's a powerful threat really close to them. And we do a really bad job with this in our country. We don't even do it, right? We really don't teach media literacy in schools unless a teacher takes it upon him or herself to do it. And in many cases, it's not until our students are at the college level, or even I experienced this with some of my law students in grad school, that they start to be thoughtful about assessing the source of a news story. I bet y'all have had this experience of reading something on Facebook or Twitter or something like that and thinking, this is terrible, and you send it to everybody on your friend list. And then you realize later, wow, that would have been terrible if it had been true. Because obviously fake stuff does circulate on social media. And I had one of those experiences early on with Twitter. And it was good that it happened to me because it caused me to pull back really sharply. And I sort of run through this assessment every time I read something that just seems like ridiculously horrible and also too neat of a fit into my preconceived narrative. I always stop to think about what's the source? Is the source legitimate? Do they have an axe to grind? Is somebody paying them money to write this? You have to do that because otherwise you're your crazy Uncle Jack on Facebook, just like reposting trash. Some of this is just common sense. And to be honest with y'all, it's something that we don't need formal education in. We can do it in community. We can do it by patiently reminding people on social media or at your weekly knitting group or wherever you go. We need to be more thoughtful. We can't be the knee-jerk reaction people who react to everything without first assessing whether or not it's true, whether or not it has a factual basis. And that, I think, is the interconnection. We got to do a better job with civics education in this country. I think Law Day, which, do y'all know what we're talking about, Law Day? Law Day is something that mostly lawyers know about. It's this one day a year called Law Day where lawyers get together and they have big luncheons and they harumph and they have a speaker. And in most states, they also do outreach in schools. So I would always go out and read a book about democracy to kids in all different age groups. There are these contests. It's really a great thing. We should have Law Day every day. I'm serious. We need to center civics education and patriotism in our culture, which we don't do, right? Because we got to take democracy for granted. And so it became very easy to make fun of the places where it failed, where our aspirations had not worked out yet. And to dismiss Congress because there was gridlock, or to dismiss, the courts for whatever reason, I think They survived in our good graces for much longer than the other two branches. To be dismissive of a president, when in fact what we need to do is be more thoughtful about the Constitution and our laws and what we're entitled to expect from our elected officials as citizens. That's really the missing link. Being well enough educated about democracy that we know what functioning democracy looks like and we know what a dysfunctional democracy looks like, so we can condemn that when it's happening and demand better. You can't really demand that people do their job if you don't know what their job is supposed to look like. And for so many people in MAGA, the thing that I'm starting to hear that really frightens me is the law is just a speed bump. The law is something that you need to get around. Oh, if the president wants to go and bomb ships, not ships, boats, that he thinks are narco-terrorists in international waters, and if all he has to do is declare that there's an international emergency in order to do that, or a national emergency, let him declare a national emergency. Don't look behind that. The courts shouldn't review his decision. If the president says it's a national emergency, it's done, and we can go bomb ships and kill people. And that's a real example of ignoring the law and letting a president function in a way that's very dangerous for all of us. So we do need to learn to recenter civics education and demand that the president, for starters, does a much better job with fidelity to the Constitution than this one does.
Your book mentions Joseph McCarthy, and you brought him up this morning in a Facebook post. Back then in the 50s, leaders were slow to talk against McCarthy, but eventually they did, in what you called in your post this morning a McCarthy moment. What could a McCarthy moment look like today?
The thing that has always fascinated me about McCarthy, when you study the history from that era, the whole Red Scare thing, right? And he's creating lists of people who are communists, except none of them are. And he's just really doing very much a congressional equivalent of what we see in the White House today. The bully who wants to take out revenge on his enemies and have his own way. And nobody pushed back, not even the president at that point in time, who was careful to avoid animosity with McCarthy. And it just looked like he was all powerful and no one could counter him until a lawyer just had had enough. McCarthy had been gotten out of sorts because he thought that one of his young aides, who he wanted special treatment for in connection with the military, didn't get it. So he decides to go after the military, and he drums up these fake allegations of fraud, and he's holding hearings, and they're being aired, and people are watching this, and McCarthy is just getting ready to damage people, including a young staffer who's working on this. And one of the lawyers who's in the room just looks at him, and there's this moment that I know you've all seen. Have you no decency, sir? And for some reason, some inexplicable reason, those words burst the bubble. McCarthy dies a few years later, alone and friendless. I mean, his power completely evaporates in a matter of months. And I have always wondered when we would see that moment with Donald Trump, when this sort of fever dream would just break. I so strongly thought during his first term that it was inevitable that Americans would call out the snake oil salesman. And it never happened, and we re-elected him. And as I was writing the book, I still believed that it was possible that we might get that moment. Although, frankly, when you've lived through the guy who, talked about grabbing women by the P word and has done all of the other horrible things that he's done that have become public, like the sexual assault of E. Jean Carroll, that a jury found in a civil case in New York happened, even though he denied it. And the fever dream doesn't break for any of this list of horribles, right? But I still thought there has to be a breaking point, a moment where Americans may turn on Donald Trump. And I thought it might happen between the time I finished the book and when it was published, and it did not. I wonder, though, and this was the point of the tweet this morning, if we aren't living through the start of that with the Epstein files. I mean, I will tell you that I started out as a skeptic. So I'm a career federal prosecutor. I've seen what's in an FBI file a time or two. I thought it was unlikely that there would be like really bad, horrible stuff in the Epstein files that hadn't already been made public, because there's so much bad stuff that's been made public. And Trump promised during the campaign that he would release the files, so I assumed that there was nothing too terrible in there. And then he started delaying and playing hide the ball once he got back into office, and my little former prosecutor radar went up. Because it would have been so easy to release it, to fulfill the campaign progress, to keep his base infatuated with him. And as soon as he began dragging his feet, you knew that there was a problem, right? That there was something in there. Maybe it was somebody else, not him, that he wanted to protect. And now we're beginning to see the truth. And I wonder if MAGA's love affair with Donald Trump might not be about to come to a conclusion. And where precisely that McCarthy moment will fall, we don't know yet. But it may well happen next week when the House of Representatives votes on the discharge petition. I'm not here to bring y'all hopium, and I don't believe in sugarcoating the facts. Donald Trump is a survivor. He's very, very good at it. But this moment feels different, and so please, 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 even if you're not the person who normally calls your legislators, this is the time to call them and tell them that you are demanding that they do everything that they can to obtain the release of those files, because this may well cause the public to look at Donald Trump with, without the rose-colored glasses that he's been passing out.
You cite several hopeful protections and bulwarks for democracy in your book. For example, our broad array of institutions like functional federalism with governors and mayors, the judiciary, decentralized voting, and others. Could you talk about these institutions and these kind of built-in protections?
So the reason I talk about the institutions in the book is to make this point. The Founding Fathers were so wise when they divided power among three branches of government, something that we all take for granted, right? I mean, it's like the holy trinity of Congress, the courts, and the president. We all learn about it from the time that we're in kindergarten on, and we get that, but there's real content to that division of power, because the Constitution was written literally in response to the rule of a king. And in this context, king is just a nice fancy word for dictator, right? I mean, that's what the three branches of government are meant to prevent. Thomas Jefferson said on more than one occasion that he believed that the press, a free press, was an essential institution, maybe more important than some of the others. And so we have this sense that by dividing power, we keep anyone from becoming a dictator. And that, I think, is the key point. When you've got a supine Congress and a Supreme Court that seems to be willing to put its thumb on the scales for a president, it's tough for government to work properly. But it has happened before in our country's history. This moment is unique in so many ways, but we have had other moments where things just looked like democracy was done. I mean, we fought a civil war in this country over slavery, and that happened in large part because the Supreme Court refused to say that black people were citizens of this country, something that one would have thought would have been obvious at that point. It happened in a case called Dred Scott, and I think the facts are worth knowing a little bit about, because Dred Scott and his wife and his daughters were taken by the man who enslaved them into free territory. And then they returned to slave territory, and they filed a lawsuit in court saying, when we went into free territory, we became free people. And there's no provision of the law that permits us to be re-enslaved. So we are now free people. And the United States Supreme Court responded by saying, sorry, you don't have the right to sue in court. You're not a citizen. You can't sue. That unbelievably mistaken case took decades to correct, right? It took a civil war, and it wasn't the court that corrected. It was Congress that passed the 14th, 15th Amendments guaranteeing Black people not only freedom from slavery, but other essential rights. And it has been up to the courts on an ongoing basis to expand and implement those laws. I mean, that's why we have the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act, because they follow from that. And so that's to say, we can get things wrong. We can go through horrible trauma as a country. We can dangerously deny people their rights and treat them badly. And then we can come back and we can get it right. And we can do that without giving up on democracy, by the way, because one of the stories I tell in the book is the story of the integration of the University of Alabama. I'm sure y'all have seen George Wallace's famous stand in the schoolhouse door. It wasn't much of a stand. He knew he was going to walk away. But he wanted to make this, last stand for segregation. And so a couple of incredibly brave young people, they're the first Black people to integrate the university. And obviously none of that is easy. And one of them is a woman named Vivian Malone Jones, who stays at the university, graduates, goes on to have a really incredible career. But while she's in school in her 4 years, she has experiences like days where she has to decide whether or not it's safe to go to class because there are bombs that are going off in proximity to her apartment. And she stays the course and she stands tall and she does that. She graduates. 50 years later, the university is celebrating the anniversary of its integration. And the sitting attorney general is a man named Eric Holder, who is Vivian Malone Jones's brother-in-law. There is a straight line from that bravery. I mean, it would have been just as easy for her, frankly, to say, a pox on you, you don't want to acknowledge my humanity and my equality, I'm not going to play your game. And instead, she was willing to put her life on the line to insist that democracy extend its promise to her, so that we could have the first African-American Attorney General in the United States 50 years later. And that is what we can do, by the way, if we don't give up.
Last question about what people can do. I was inspired by your online conversation with our past speaker, Heather Cox Richardson.
Everybody reads Heather, right?
And you all got into talking about knitting. You both knit, and how people were knitting for democracy and making things. And so what's the lesson? How do we learn to stand for democracy in our own ways?
I mean, don't we have to be able to have fun? I'm not going to let Donald Trump suck all the joy out of my life, right? The whole reason we want to have a democracy is so we can have good, happy, meaningful lives. And so do y'all remember, did any of y'all knit the pink pussy hats right after? I mean, I found mine the other day. I was looking through my winter hats and I found it. And I remembered what that was like to sit around with my knitting group. We were all so upset after that first election. And we knit together. It was a way of being in community, which is what knitters do best. We knit in community. And I'm reminded of the powerful lessons of the foot soldiers from the civil rights movement. One of the blessings of living in Birmingham, and now, unfortunately, we're getting to the point where many of them are beginning to pass. But for so many years, I had the benefit of being able to talk with people who marched in Selma, people who had marched in Birmingham, not the leaders of those marches who were like fascinating, inspirational people too, but just like the folks who decided to go out and march, and to ask them, why did you do what you did? How did it work out? What did you learn? What can we do today? And they would always say, be in community. Don't try to do it alone. You don't have to defeat, for them it was Jim Crow. You don't have to do it as an individual. You can do it in community as a group. You can sing together, march together, knit together when it comes to Donald Trump. But I think that that's the lesson. The reason so many of us feel overwhelmed is because we're trying to shoulder the horrible burden of this president on our own and do what we can alone. And you do not have to, nor should you do it alone. You should absolutely do it in community, in groups like this room, in online groups if that works for you, or in local groups if that's what works for you. But find yourself folks who will lift you up and keep you motivated on the bad days, and we will absolutely get through this together.
I have a present for you because we like to say it's our time. That's why we give clocks. Here's your name engraved. Oh, this is for Beverly Manny. You're Joyce Vance.
I am.
We'll get you the right clock.
It's a gorgeous clock, though. I love this.
Thank you for a beautiful evening.